You're standing in the control room of a submerged nuclear submarine. The depth gauge reads 400 meters. Red lights pulse across every console. A klaxon screams through the compartment. Your captain's voice cuts through the noise. All stations stand down. Do not engage fire suppression. Do you obey? The air is thick. Smoke curls from a ventilation duct near the reactor compartment bulkhead. Temperature readings climb on 3 separate monitors. The man next to you, Petty Officer 2nd Class Viktor Kozlov, reaches for the manual override lever on the emergency coolant system. His hand hovers. The captain's order still echoes in his headset. He pulls the lever. The sound is immediate. Compressed gas hisses through pipes. Coolant floods into the sealed compartment beyond the bulkhead. The captain is shouting now, demanding to know who initiated the system. Kozlov doesn't answer. He's already moving to the next station, fingers flying across a touchscreen interface designed for 3-person operation. He's alone. This is October 3, 1986. Soviet submarine K-219. Somewhere in the Atlantic, international waters, 600 kilometers off the coast of Bermuda. The vessel is dying. And the man who just disobeyed a direct order has approximately 4 minutes to prove he was right. Or to ensure his court-martial will be the least of his concerns. 6 hours earlier, the K-219 was running routine patrol depth. A Yankee-class ballistic missile submarine, 16 missile tubes, older design but still operational. The crew numbered 119. Most had been at sea for 72 days. Fatigue was standard. Maintenance was behind schedule. Command had ordered the patrol extended another 2 weeks. At 0514 hours, a seal failed in missile tube 6. Not catastrophic. Not immediately. The tube contained a liquid-fueled R-27 missile. 2 propellants, unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide. Hypergolic. Meaning they ignite on contact with each other. Meaning if the seal fails, if the fuel and oxidizer mix, you don't get a warning. You get a detonation. The seal failed slowly. A hairline fracture in a gasket that had been certified for another 6 months. The fracture widened. Oxidizer began to leak. Droplets. Then a thin stream. It contacted residue from a previous fuel transfer. The reaction started as a glow. Then a flame. Then an expanding fireball inside a sealed metal tube standing 3 stories tall, mounted in the hull of a pressurized submarine beneath 400 meters of ocean. The explosion blew the missile tube access hatch off its hinges. Seawater poured in. Not catastrophically. Not yet. But the chemical fire was now exposed to the submarine's atmosphere. Toxic smoke, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, hydrazine vapor, began flooding through the ventilation system. The reactor compartment was directly aft of the missile bay. Between them, 3 bulkhead doors and a network of shared ductwork. Kozlov was off duty. He was in the berthing area when the first alarm sounded. He ran to the control room. By the time he arrived, the captain had already made his assessment. The fire was chemical. Water wouldn't suppress it. Foam might spread it. The ventilation system had to be shut down to prevent smoke from reaching the reactor. The reactor had to be kept online to maintain depth control and life support. The damaged compartment had to be sealed. Everyone inside would have to evacuate or remain and fight the fire manually. 3 men were still in the missile compartment. The captain gave the order: seal the bulkheads, cut ventilation, maintain reactor operations. No automated suppression. No flooding. The men inside would have to use handheld extinguishers and hope the fire burned itself out before the smoke killed them. Kozlov heard the order. He looked at the reactor temperature gauges. They were climbing. The ventilation shutdown meant heat wasn't being vented from the reactor space. The shared ductwork meant smoke and superheated air were being pulled toward the reactor intake despite the closed dampers. The reactor was being starved of clean air and simultaneously baked by rising ambient temperature. He knew what would happen next. The reactor would scram, emergency shutdown, if temperature exceeded safety margins. Loss of reactor meant loss of propulsion. Loss of propulsion at 400 meters meant slow drift to crush depth or uncontrolled ascent. Either way, the submarine would be on the surface, crippled, in international waters, during the Cold War, carrying 16 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles. Kozlov didn't have authority to override the captain. He didn't have time to argue. He had the technical knowledge to understand that the order, though procedurally correct, was based on incomplete information. The captain didn't know the reactor cooling was compromised. The reactor officer hadn't reported it yet because he was still verifying the readings. Kozlov pulled the emergency coolant lever. The emergency reactor coolant system on a Yankee-class submarine is not designed for precision. It's designed for one scenario: runaway reactor temperature when all other cooling has failed. It floods the reactor compartment with seawater. It prevents meltdown. It also renders the reactor permanently inoperable. The submarine becomes a dead weight. No power. No lights. No air circulation. Just a steel tube sinking slowly into the Atlantic with 119 men inside. Kozlov didn't flood the reactor. He activated the secondary coolant loop, a parallel system meant for gradual temperature reduction during controlled shutdown. It's not an emergency system. It's not designed to be operated manually during a fire. But it shares plumbing with the emergency flood system, and if you know which valves to open and in what sequence, you can route coolant without triggering the full emergency cascade. He opened 3 valves in 7 seconds. He bypassed 2 safety interlocks by physically holding override buttons that required simultaneous activation. That's why he was alone at the panel. It's a 2-person procedure. He was using his left hand, right hand, and forehead. Coolant began flowing. Reactor temperature stabilized. Then started to drop. Too fast. Drop it too quickly and you risk thermal shock, metal components contracting at different rates, fractures in the pressure vessel, loss of containment. Kozlov needed to slow the flow. The manual valve for that was 6 meters away, behind a console, accessible only by crawling under a cable tray that was now dripping with condensation and oil. He crawled. The captain was still shouting. 2 other officers were moving toward him. He reached the valve. It was a wheel, meant to be turned slowly, quarter rotation at a time. He spun it. The flow rate adjusted. Reactor temperature leveled at 92 degrees above normal operating range. Still critical. But not scramming. Then the lights went out. The fire in the missile compartment had reached the primary electrical bus. Not the reactor's power, that was isolated. But the ship's distribution system, the network that fed lighting, navigation, communications, non-critical systems. It tripped. Circuit breakers blew in sequence. The control room dropped into darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in 3 seconds later, dim red bulbs, battery-powered, designed to last 40 minutes. Kozlov was still under the console. He couldn't see the valve anymore. He was turning it by feel, counting rotations, trying to remember the maintenance manual he'd read 2 years earlier during technical school. The wheel slipped. His hand was wet. He repositioned. Turned again. Somewhere behind him, someone was reading off reactor stats by flashlight. Temperature holding. Pressure climbing. Not critical yet. But trending wrong. The reactor officer's voice. Secondary loop is active. Who authorized secondary loop? The captain. Shut it down. Shut it down now. Kozlov didn't shut it down. He fine-tuned the valve another quarter turn and crawled back toward the main panel. The 2 officers were waiting for him. One grabbed his shoulder. Kozlov shook him off and pointed at the reactor temperature display. If we shut it down now, we scram in 90 seconds. The officer looked at the gauge. Looked at Kozlov. The captain gave an order. The captain doesn't have the reactor data. Get him the data. The reactor officer hesitated. Then moved to the communication panel. Picked up the handset. Relayed the numbers. The captain's voice came back, quieter now. Hold position. Maintain secondary loop. Stand by for further orders. Kozlov exhaled. Then the smoke detector in the control room went off. The ventilation shutdown had failed. Not completely, but enough. Smoke was bypassing the closed dampers through a maintenance access duct that hadn't been sealed properly during the last yard period. The duct ran from the missile compartment, through the engineering spaces, into the control room. It was a 10-centimeter gap in a welded seam. Enough for smoke. Enough for toxic vapor. The control room crew started coughing. Kozlov pulled his shirt over his mouth. Didn't help. The smoke was chemical, acrid, burning in the throat and lungs. Nitrogen dioxide. Exposure causes pulmonary edema. Fluid in the lungs. Drowning on dry land. At sea, it's drowning in a sealed metal compartment with no escape. The captain ordered evacuation of the control room. Non-essential personnel to the forward berthing. Essential crew to don breathing apparatus and remain at stations. Kozlov wasn't technically essential. He was a reactor technician. His station was aft. But the reactor officer was incapacitated, coughing, doubled over. Someone needed to monitor the secondary coolant loop. Kozlov stayed. There were 4 breathing masks in the control room. 6 men remaining. Kozlov didn't take a mask. He gave his to the navigation officer, who had started vomiting. Then he returned to the reactor panel. His eyes were streaming. His lungs felt like cracked glass. He could taste blood. He kept adjusting the coolant flow. The fire in the missile compartment was still burning. The 3 men trapped inside had stopped responding to radio calls. The bulkhead door was too hot to touch. The captain made the decision to flood the compartment. Not with coolant. With seawater. Open the sea valves, let the Atlantic in, drown the fire and everything else. Kozlov heard the order. He knew what it meant. Flooding the missile compartment would add thousands of tons of water to the submarine's forward section. The boat would pitch nose down. Already at 400 meters. Add wake forward, lose trim control, and you descend. Fast. The reactor had to stay online to maintain ballast and depth. Which meant Kozlov had to keep the secondary loop running. Which meant he had to stay at the panel. In the smoke. Without a mask. The sea valves opened. Water roared into the missile compartment. The submarine's bow dipped. 15 degrees. 20. Kozlov grabbed a handhold as the deck tilted. The reactor temperature spiked. Seawater flooding the compartment was changing the thermal dynamics, adding cold mass near the reactor bulkhead, creating convection currents that pulled heat away from the coolant loop. He adjusted the flow. Too much. Temperature dropped too fast. He corrected. The submarine pitched further. 25 degrees down. Then the primary coolant pump failed. The pump didn't seize. It tripped offline. Safety interlock. When the submarine pitched past 20 degrees, a tilt sensor detected the angle and automatically shut down the primary coolant pump to prevent cavitation, air bubbles in the coolant flow that could cause the pump to destroy itself. Standard safety feature. Except the secondary loop couldn't handle full reactor heat on its own. It was designed as a supplement, not a replacement. Reactor temperature began climbing again. Faster now. Kozlov bypassed the tilt sensor interlock. He'd never done it before. The procedure wasn't in the manual. But he understood the electrical logic. He pulled the sensor's power fuse. The pump restarted. Temperature stabilized. Then the pump started vibrating. Loud, rhythmic clanging. The bearings were failing. They'd been operating past rated specs for 6 hours. Metal fatigue. Friction heat. The pump was eating itself. Kozlov knew it would cease completely within minutes. When it did, the reactor would scram. He had one option: switch to full emergency coolant. Flood the reactor compartment. Kill the reactor. Surface the submarine. He reached for the lever. Then stopped. The captain's voice, over the intercom. Reactor section, report status. Kozlov picked up the handset. His voice was hoarse. Primary pump is failing. I can keep it running for maybe 3 more minutes. After that, we have to flood or we scram. Understood. We've regained trim. Leveling at 420 meters. The fire is suppressed. Beginning damage assessment. Kozlov looked at the depth gauge. 420 meters. Within operational range. Barely. The missile compartment was flooded but isolated. The fire was out. The reactor was still online. The submarine was stable. He hadn't killed them. Yet. The 3 men in the missile compartment were dead. They'd been dead before the flooding started. Smoke inhalation. The radio calls had stopped because they'd lost consciousness. The decision to flood the compartment hadn't killed them. But it had sealed them inside. When the submarine surfaced, if it surfaced, their bodies would be recovered from a space filled with seawater, chemical residue, and the wreckage of a detonated missile tube. Kozlov didn't know they were dead. Not yet. He was still at the reactor panel, watching the primary pump vibration readings climb. The bearing temperature was past red line. The pump was running on momentum and luck. He needed it to last long enough to get the reactor into controlled shutdown. Not a scram. A proper, gradual reduction. Textbook procedure. 20 minutes minimum. The pump lasted 8. Then it seized. Total mechanical failure. The coolant flow stopped. Reactor temperature spiked. Kozlov had 4 seconds to make a decision. Flood the reactor and surface the boat, or let it scram and hope the emergency systems kept them off the bottom. He flooded the reactor. Seawater rushed into the reactor compartment. The temperature dropped instantly. Steam vented through overflow pipes. The reactor shut down. Not a scram, controlled, deliberate. The submarine lost power. Emergency batteries took over. Minimal systems. Lighting. Life support. Navigation. No propulsion. The boat began to drift upward, buoyancy overcoming weight as ballast was blown. They surfaced 12 minutes later. Atlantic Ocean. Night. No moon. The submarine wallowed in 3-meter swells, listing 7 degrees to port, missile compartment flooded, reactor dead, crew alive. 96 hours later, a Soviet rescue tug arrived. The K-219 was taken under tow. It sank 3 days into the transit, 600 meters down, while being repositioned for a longer tow line. Everyone had been evacuated. The submarine remains on the ocean floor. So do the bodies of the 3 men from the missile compartment. And 6 nuclear warheads. Kozlov was court-martialed. The charge: disobeying direct orders during emergency operations. The defense: his actions prevented reactor meltdown and kept the submarine under control long enough to surface safely. The verdict: guilty, with commendation for technical competence. Sentence: reprimand, transfer to shore duty, no prison time. He never went to sea again. Here's what Kozlov did that wasn't in the manual. First, he activated the secondary coolant loop without authorization. Not technically illegal, but outside his operational authority. The reactor officer should have made that call. The reactor officer was focused on monitoring primary systems. Kozlov made the assessment that secondary intervention was necessary and executed without waiting for approval. In hindsight, correct. In the moment, insubordination. Second, he bypassed 2 safety interlocks simultaneously. The secondary loop activation requires 2 operators because the interlock override buttons are positioned to prevent accidental engagement. One person can't reach both. Kozlov used his forehead on one button while his hands operated the valves. Creative. Dangerous. It worked. Third, he disabled a tilt sensor to restart the primary pump. The sensor exists to protect the pump from damage during extreme angles. Disabling it allowed the pump to run in conditions it wasn't designed for. The pump failed anyway. But it lasted long enough. If he hadn't disabled the sensor, the reactor would have scrammed 30 minutes earlier, while the submarine was still nose down and flooding. Loss of power during that phase would have meant uncontrolled descent. Possibly to crush depth. Fourth, he made the decision to flood the reactor without confirming the captain's intent. The captain had ordered, "Stand by for further orders." Kozlov interpreted that as authorization to act if conditions deteriorated. conditions deteriorated. He acted. The captain later stated he would have given the same order. But Kozlov didn't wait to find out. Each of these actions violated procedure. Each of them, in isolation, could have caused catastrophic failure. Together, they kept the submarine afloat. So was he right or was he reckless? Soviet submarine doctrine in 1986 was built on a principle: centralized command, decentralized execution. The captain makes strategic decisions. Department heads execute tactically. Specialists follow technical protocols. The system works when information flows correctly and when conditions match the scenarios planners anticipated. The K-219 emergency matched no anticipated scenario. The doctrine for missile tube fire: seal the compartment, vent atmosphere overboard, suppress with onboard systems. The doctrine assumed the fire could be isolated without affecting reactor operations. It didn't account for shared ventilation pathways that couldn't be fully sealed. The doctrine for reactor cooling loss: activate emergency systems, scram if necessary, surface immediately. It didn't account for a scenario where surfacing while nose down and flooding could cause loss of control. It didn't provide guidance for using secondary systems as primary replacements. The doctrine for crew incapacitation: senior officer assumes command, follows standard procedures. It didn't account for a situation where the senior officer lacked real-time technical data and the junior specialist had information the command couldn't access quickly enough. Kozlov operated in the gap between doctrine and reality. He had technical knowledge the command staff didn't. He had access to data they couldn't see from the bridge. He made tactical decisions that should have come from above, but there wasn't time for the information to flow up and the orders to flow down. The institutional response was predictable. The Navy couldn't publicly endorse individual initiative over command authority. But they also couldn't ignore the outcome. Kozlov prevented a reactor meltdown. Possibly prevented loss of the entire crew. The court-martial was procedural. The commendation was political. The transfer to shore duty was the compromise. But here's the deeper question: if doctrine fails when reality doesn't match planning, and if specialists like Kozlov can see failure coming before commanders can, what's the command structure actually for? The captain of the K-219 believed he was making the right decision. Seal the fire, protect the reactor, maintain operational capability. His information was incomplete. He didn't know the ventilation seals had failed. He didn't know the reactor cooling was compromised. He was making strategic choices based on standard threat assessment. Kozlov believed the captain's order would kill everyone. His information was more complete but localized. He could see the reactor data. He understood the thermodynamics. But he didn't have visibility into the overall tactical situation. He didn't know if the missile compartment could be saved. He didn't know if flooding it would cause the submarine to sink. Both men were acting on partial information. Both made rational decisions given what they knew. The difference: Kozlov's decision required violating orders. The captain's decision required trust that his subordinates would execute correctly. When Kozlov pulled the emergency coolant lever, he wasn't just acting on technical knowledge. He was making a judgment call about whose incomplete picture was less wrong. He bet that his local, detailed understanding of reactor behavior was more accurate than the captain's global, strategic assessment. He was right. But he could have been wrong. Here's the institutional nightmare: if you reward Kozlov for disobeying orders, you encourage every specialist to second-guess command decisions. If you punish him despite the successful outcome, you discourage initiative when doctrine fails. Either way, you erode the command structure. The Soviet Navy chose a middle path. Court-martial to preserve discipline. Commendation to acknowledge reality. Transfer to prevent repetition. Kozlov spent the rest of his career teaching reactor operations at a technical school. He never spoke publicly about the K-219. His official record lists him as competent but unsuited for operational command. The captain was promoted, then quietly reassigned to administrative duty. His official record lists him as exemplary commander, strong strategic judgment. Neither statement is false. Mather is complete. The K-219 incident became a case study in Soviet naval training. Not in the official curriculum, but in the unwritten education senior officers passed to junior ones over late-night discussions in officers' quarters. The lesson wasn't, follow Kozlov's example. It was, understand when doctrine is a guide and when it's a constraint. Here's what changed quietly in the years after 1986. Reactor technicians received expanded authority to activate secondary systems without command approval during specific temperature thresholds. Not full autonomy, but recognition that local expertise matters. Ventilation systems on missile submarines were redesigned to eliminate shared ductwork between missile compartments and reactor spaces. Engineering fixed to a doctrinal gap. Communication protocols were revised to prioritize technical data flow during emergencies. Not replacing command authority, but ensuring commanders had access to specialist knowledge faster. None of these changes were attributed to K-219. Officially, they were part of ongoing modernization. Unofficially, they were the Navy's admission that Kozlov had been right and the system had been inadequate. But here's what didn't change: the fundamental tension between command authority and specialist judgment. Because you can't systematize intuition. You can't write a procedure that says, disobey orders when you're certain your commander is wrong. Certainty is subjective. Wrong is determined by outcome. And outcomes aren't known until it's too late to change the decision. The K-219 survived because one man made a guess. An informed, educated, technically sophisticated guess. But a guess. If the reactor had failed anyway, if the submarine had sunk, if the crew had died, Kozlov would be remembered as the insubordinate technician whose arrogance killed 119 men. Instead, he's a footnote in a classified incident report, cited anonymously in training materials as an example of appropriate technical initiative during ambiguous command situations. Which is the institutional way of saying, we don't know if we should celebrate him or condemn him, so we'll do neither. The K-219 wasn't the last submarine emergency where a junior crew member disobeyed orders. It wasn't even the last Soviet submarine emergency that year. But it became the reference point. 3 years later, 1989. Soviet submarine K-278 Komsomolets. Fire in the aft compartment. Captain orders evacuation of the affected section. A Mitchman, warrant officer, stays behind to manually operate a damaged fire suppression system. The system requires 2 people. He operates it alone, using the same forehead and both hands technique Kozlov improvised. The fire is suppressed. The Mitchman dies from smoke inhalation. The submarine surfaces. Then sinks anyway due to unrelated flooding. 42 crew members die. The Mitchman is posthumously declared a hero of the Soviet Union. His name was recorded. Kozlov's wasn't. The difference: the Mitchman died. Martyrs are easier to honor than survivors. Survivors complicate the narrative. 2 years after that, 1991. Soviet Union collapses. The submarine fleet is divided among successor states. Many vessels are decommissioned. The institutional knowledge about incidents like K-219 fragments. The case studies remain classified. The lessons are preserved in oral tradition among submarine officers who served during that era. But the formal doctrine reverts. Command authority is reasserted. Specialist initiative is quietly discouraged. By 2000, the Russian Navy had largely forgotten K-219. Then the Kursk sank. Another submarine emergency. Another set of decisions made under incomplete information. Another institutional failure to acknowledge that doctrine doesn't cover every scenario. The pattern repeats because the underlying problem is unsolvable. Submarines operate in an environment hostile to human life. The margin for error is zero. The information available to decision-makers is always incomplete. Someone has to make a choice. Sometimes the person with the best information isn't the person with the authority. When those two things misalign, people die. Or they survive because someone broke the rules. Kozlov broke the rules. The crew survived. The Navy court-martialed him, and then pretended it never happened. The submarine sank during tow and took 6 nuclear warheads to the ocean floor. The incident was declassified in 2005. By then, Kozlov had retired. He lives in Murmansk. He doesn't give interviews. The formal investigation into the K-219 incident took 9 months. The report was classified. Portions were declassified in 2005. The full document remains restricted. What we know, the investigation concluded that the missile tube seal failure was caused by improper maintenance during the previous yard period. The maintenance crew had used a non-standard gasket because the specified part wasn't available. The substitute gasket met dimensional specs but not chemical resistance specs. It degraded over time. The failure was preventable. The investigation also concluded that the fire suppression response was inadequate. The ventilation shutdown didn't isolate the fire because the maintenance access duct hadn't been sealed. The duct should have been welded shut after the last yard period. It wasn't. The work order was in the system. The work wasn't completed. The failure was procedural. The investigation further concluded that the decision to flood the missile compartment was correct given the information available. The 3 crew members inside were already deceased at the time of the decision. The flooding prevented the fire from spreading to adjacent compartments. The decision was tactically sound. Regarding Kozlov's actions, the investigation found that his activation of the secondary coolant loop was outside normal operational parameters but consistent with emergency response principles. His disabling of the tilt sensor was improvised but effective. His decision to flood the reactor was premature but ultimately necessary. The language is bureaucratic. The meaning is clear: he violated procedure, but the outcome justified the violations. Recommendation: no criminal charges. Administrative reprimand. Transfer to non-operational duty. No change to existing doctrine. The last point is the most telling. The investigation acknowledged Kozlov was right. It acknowledged the doctrine was insufficient. But it recommended no changes. Because changing doctrine would require admitting the doctrine was wrong. And admitting the doctrine was wrong would undermine command authority across the entire submarine fleet. So the lesson learned was, hope you have a Kozlov on board when doctrine fails. But don't train people to be Kozlov. Because if everyone acts like Kozlov, no one follows orders, and the command structure collapses. It's an impossible standard. And everyone involved knew it. The K-219 surfaced in international waters. Atlantic Ocean. 600 kilometers from Bermuda. U.S. Navy assets were in the area. Surveillance aircraft. Attack submarines. Surface ships. They knew a Soviet ballistic missile submarine had surfaced. They didn't know why. The immediate U.S. response: maintain distance, observe, prepare for possible escalation. The Cold War was still cold. But a Soviet boomer surfacing unexpectedly, listing, clearly damaged, that's a scenario that could turn hot very quickly. Soviet response: denial. No acknowledgement of the incident. No request for assistance. A rescue tug was dispatched, but the official line was routine operational redeployment. The U.S. didn't believe it. But without confirmation, they couldn't act. For 6 days, the K-219 wallowed on the surface while diplomats argued and naval commanders positioned assets. The U.S. wanted to offer assistance. Protocol. Maritime law. Also intelligence opportunity. Get close to a Soviet missile sub, assess damage, maybe get eyes on the missile tubes. The Soviets refused. National pride. Operational security. Fear of what the U.S. might learn. Then the submarine sank during tow. Accident. Possibly sabotage, though no evidence supports that. More likely mechanical failure. The boat was too damaged to survive open ocean towing. When it went down, it took 16 missiles, 6 nuclear warheads, and the bodies of 3 crew members. The U.S. Navy tracked the sinking. They know where the K-219 rests. 600 meters down. International waters. The warheads are still there. Encased in the wreckage. Degrading slowly. Releasing radiation into the Atlantic. Not dangerous yet. But eventually. Maybe in 50 years. Maybe in 500. No one's going to recover them. Too deep. Too politically complicated. So the K-219 sits on the ocean floor as a monument to the incident no one officially acknowledges. Kozlov's decision kept the crew alive long enough to evacuate. But the submarine itself became a permanent casualty. A nuclear waste site no one will clean up. A reminder that some crises don't have clean resolutions. Kozlov was 23 when the K-219 sank. He'd been in the Navy for 5 years. Trained as a reactor technician. Top marks in technical school. Promising career. After the court-martial, he was transferred to a training facility in Severodvinsk. He taught reactor operations to conscripts. Same material he'd learned years earlier. No operational duty. No sea time. Just classrooms and textbooks and students who didn't know his name meant anything. He married in 1989. Had 2 children. Retired from the Navy in 1998 with a pension and a service record that listed him as satisfactory. Moved to Murmansk. Worked as a maintenance supervisor at a civilian power plant. Retired again in 2015. He doesn't talk about the K-219. When journalists found him after the incident was declassified, he declined interviews. When a documentary crew approached him, he refused to participate. His former shipmates say he's private. Not bitter. Not traumatized. Just done. He made a decision. It worked out. He moved on. The captain of the K-219 also declined interviews. He retired as a rear admiral. Received multiple commendations. His official biography mentions commanding the K-219 but doesn't reference the incident. He lives in St. Petersburg. No public statements. No memoirs. The institutional silence extends to both men. The 3 crew members who died in the missile compartment were buried at sea with the submarine. Their families received pensions and official condolences. Their names are listed on a memorial in Murmansk. No explanation of how they died. Just names and dates. They're remembered as casualties of operational duty. Technically accurate. Emotionally insufficient. The rest of the crew scattered. Some stayed in the Navy. Some left. A few wrote about the experience, anonymously, in memoirs published after the Soviet collapse. The accounts vary. Some credit Kozlov. Some don't mention him. Some describe the incident as a near disaster. Others call it a successful emergency response. Memory is selective. Trauma reshapes narrative. Truth becomes fragmented. What's consistent? No one claims they would have done anything differently. Not the captain. Not the reactor officer. Not Kozlov. Everyone made decisions based on what they knew. Everyone survived except the 3 who were already doomed. The system failed. Individual competence compensated. The institution took credit. Life continued. Military organizations trained for obedience. Chain of command. Orders. Discipline. The structure exists because chaos kills. In combat, hesitation is fatal. Someone has to decide. Everyone else has to execute. No debate. No second guessing. The system works when the person giving orders has better information than the person receiving them. But what happens when that assumption breaks? The K-219 is one example. History is full of others. Stanislav Petrov, Soviet officer who refused to report a false nuclear launch warning in 1983. If he'd followed protocol, he would have escalated. Escalation could have triggered retaliation. Retaliation could have started World War III. He didn't follow protocol. He used judgment. He was right. He was also reprimanded for improper procedure. Vasily Arkhipov, Soviet submarine officer during the Cuban Missile Crisis. His submarine was depth-charged by U.S. forces. The captain wanted to launch a nuclear torpedo. Arkhipov refused to concur. Soviet procedure required unanimous agreement among 3 senior officers. Arkhipov's refusal prevented a launch. Possibly prevented nuclear war. He was never publicly acknowledged. The pattern: junior or mid-level officers with specialized knowledge making decisions that contradict orders from superiors who lack that knowledge. When they're right, they're quietly tolerated. When they're wrong, they're court-martialed. The system can't reward them without undermining itself. But it can't function without them. This is the doctrine that doesn't exist. The institutional knowledge that's never written down. The understanding among experienced officers that sometimes the rules have to bend. Not break. Bend. There's a difference. Breaking the rules is insubordination. Bending them is initiative. The line between the two is determined by outcome. Which means you don't know which side you're on until after the fact. Kozlov bent the rules. He activated systems without authorization. He bypassed safety interlocks. He made command decisions without command authority. He also prevented a reactor meltdown and saved 119 lives. The Navy couldn't punish him without looking incompetent. Couldn't reward him without encouraging insubordination. So they did both. Court-martial and commendation. Guilty and competent. The institutional equivalent of saying, "You were right, but don't do it again." Except someone will have to do it again. Because submarines still fail. Reactors still overheat. Fires still spread. And doctrine still doesn't cover every scenario. When that happens, someone like Kozlov will have to decide: follow the order or trust the data. Obey the captain or save the crew. The system depends on people making that choice correctly. But it can't tell them how. The K219 incident isn't historical curiosity. It's current operational reality. Submarine emergencies still happen. Command decisions are still made under incomplete information. Specialists still have to choose between procedure and improvisation. August 2000. Russian submarine Kursk. Torpedo explosion. The submarine sank in shallow water with the crew trapped inside. Rescue attempts failed. All 118 crew members died. Post-incident analysis revealed that several crew members survived the initial explosion and attempted emergency procedures. Some improvised. Some followed doctrine. All died waiting for rescue that came too late. Could a Kozlov-type intervention have saved them? Unknown. The circumstances were different. The damage was catastrophic. But the question lingers: if someone had violated procedure, bypassed safety systems, taken unauthorized action, could it have made a difference? April 2019. Russian submarine Losharik. Fire in the battery compartment. The crew fought the fire manually. 14 died. The submarine surfaced. The remaining crew survived. Official report: the crew followed proper emergency procedures. Unofficial accounts: at least one crew member bypassed standard suppression protocols to prevent the fire from reaching the nuclear reactor. No names released. No commendations announced. The pattern repeats. The lesson from K219 wasn't institutionalized. It was internalized. Submarine crews know the story. They know Kozlov's name, even if the official records don't highlight it. They know that sometimes you have to act outside doctrine. They also know the institution won't protect you if you're wrong. So the question every specialist faces during an emergency remains the same: do you trust the procedure or trust your judgment? Do you wait for orders or act on incomplete information? Do you risk court-martial to prevent catastrophe? Kozlov chose action. He was right. Others have chosen action and been wrong. The difference is luck, knowledge, and timing. The institution can't teach that. It can only punish failure and quietly tolerate success. If you're in the control room of a submarine at 400 meters depth, watching temperature gauges climb past redline, listening to your captain order you to stand down, and you're certain, based on your training and your understanding of the systems, that following that order will kill everyone on board. What do? Kozlov pulled the lever. He activated systems without authorization. He violated procedure. He saved the crew. The Navy court-martialed him, and then never let him go to sea again. He's alive. The crew is alive. The submarine is at the bottom of the Atlantic. The 3 men in the missile compartment are still inside. Was he a hero? The institution says no. His shipmates say yes. The families of the 3 dead men say nothing. The official record lists him as competent but unsuitable for command. The unofficial record calls him the man who prevented a nuclear disaster. Both are true. Neither is complete. Because heroism in a submarine emergency isn't about bravery. It's about knowledge. Kozlov didn't charge into danger. He turned a valve. He bypassed an interlock. He made technical decisions under pressure. The courage wasn't physical. It was intellectual. The willingness to trust his understanding over the captain's authority. To bet the lives of 119 people on his interpretation of reactor data. He won the bet. This time. Next time, it'll be someone else's decision. Different submarine. Different emergency. Different specialists looking at different data and weighing the same impossible choice. Follow the order or trust the knowledge. Obey the system or save the crew. The institution can't tell them which to choose. Because if the institution endorses disobedience, the command structure collapses. But if the institution demands obedience regardless of outcome, specialists like Kozlov won't act when action is necessary. So the system stumbles forward, dependent on individuals it can't officially acknowledge, punishing the behavior it secretly requires, hoping that when the moment comes, someone will have the knowledge and the nerve to pull the lever. You're standing in the control room of a submerged submarine. The alarms are screaming. The temperature gauges are climbing. Your captain's voice is ordering you to stand down. You have seconds to decide. Do you obey the order? Or do you pull the lever? Kozlov made his choice. It worked. The crew survived. The submarine didn't. And the institutional response was silence. No celebration. No condemnation. Just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the rules fail and someone has to act anyway. That tension, between procedure and improvisation, between command and expertise, between obedience and survival, doesn't resolve. It's the nature of operating in environments where mistakes are fatal and information is incomplete. Someone has to make decisions. Sometimes the person with the authority isn't the person with the knowledge. When that happens, the system depends on individuals willing to risk everything on their judgment. Kozlov was willing. He pulled the lever. He disobeyed the order. He saved the crew. And then he spent the rest of his career teaching reactor operations to conscripts who never knew his name meant anything. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that heroes get rewarded. But that competence under pressure is its own justification. The system will take credit. The institution will move on. But the people who were there, who survived because someone made the right call at the right moment, they know. And in the end, maybe that's enough. If you were in that control room, what would you have done? If this analysis made you think, consider sharing your perspective in the comments. Subscribe for more in-depth military case studies. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next breakdown. And if you found value here, a like helps others find these stories. Because the lessons from the K2-19 aren't just history. They're still being written. Every time someone faces the choice between procedure and judgment, the question remains, what would you do?